What's up, everyone? This is Mike, and we're getting into some serious character modeling now. So, what we need to do before that is go over just a few more tools. I know it might get a little bit overwhelming, but having it in video form is going to be able to solidify that for you guys. So, something I want to go over first is axis or axes. Like you have your Z or your X, Y, and Z axes. Um, and these ones, if I go into my move tool with W, you'll be able to visualize them a little bit more. This is important to keep note of, like where you are in 3D space, because what we want to do is have all of our models in 0, 0, so standing at 0, 0 on the grid. They'll be somewhere like this, and we need them to be facing Z forward, because that's how a lot of auto rigging software works. Some might be different, but the ones that I've used so far have all been Z axis forward. It's a little bit arbitrary, but that's fine. We just roll with the standards of the industry. But having it point towards Z forward is gonna help things out a lot more. However, if you ended up modeling it pointing, let me point this over here. Rotate on Y. If I point this over, like, so say you accidentally model it pointing this way, you could just rotate it back to face that Z axis. But something to note about the rotation tool that I haven't shown you guys yet is if you hold J, nothing's going to change visually, but when you go into one of these axes, you'll see that it now snaps. And this is snapping by 5 degrees, I believe. And if I go into my tool settings, you can always find tool settings with this hammer. So if something's going awry with your tool, first check these settings, and you can always reset them. And so do you remember how it was going by 5 degrees before? When I reset, it set the snap angle to 15. So now if I rotate it, it's going by 15. So this is 90. This would be 45 because it's halfway between those. And then you got 15 and 30, respectively. So that's just some nice little things, some nice little tidbits about rotation. But back into the more axis type discussion. If I rotate my tool, you'll see that rotation goes up into 67.8. Sure, cool. And if I hold E and left click, you'll see a bunch of different types of axes pop up. That's what these are. Or it's basically, not all of them are axes, but they're basically how you're going to interface with this object. So if I go to world, you'll see that my rotation manipulator popped back into that original rotation. And you see when I move it now, it doesn't rotate visually with the object. It just stays there. But that rotation is still there. So then you're like, what's the point of that? I mean, it's going to be very situational, right? So if I go back into object, you'll see that red axis, if I go into world, red axis is there, but we're at 111 degrees. So in there, if I go into object axis by holding E and left clicking, you'll see it's in there. And the same goes for the move tool. So it defaults to world. But if I move it to object, you'll see now that Z axis forward in object space is rotated to 111. So I can just move that forward on its own axis now. So that's where it comes in handy. Say this was a sword, big sword. You modeled it up. It was really cool, and you rotated it, and you haven't yet mesh combined it with your character, so it's still a separate object, right? What we can do is if we have to change the mesh, if I go in my modeling toolkit, make some edge loops in here, and you're like, oh man, I want these edges to poke out more, like in the objects space, you can just see in world, if you wanted to continue this shape further along that axis, you'd have to basically eyeball it, right? And you'd be like, ah, man, it's not super precise. But if you go into object mode, you'll see that your axis, because you rotated it while in object mode, and that has all of you, like, look at these crazy transformations. You have now you have that axis recorded so you can move along it now. So it's pretty useful for like adding objects that are kind of separate from your character to that. And if you have everything perfect exactly where you want to go and you never want to go back, like say like you moved it here, this object's going to be here and it's never going to change. Like you're done with these values, you never want to move this again. But you want that object pivot to be reset, right? What you can do is you can go into modify, and in modify you have some freezing tools, and what we're gonna go with is freeze transformations. You'll see that if we click on the dialog box, we get a bunch of different values in here. And I only have translate, in other words, your position, checked. And if I apply, you'll see that it is now zeroed out. So now this object is there. Like that's its origin point, and that's like 0 for that object. So if we move that, and then now it has a bunch of random values on there, if we zero that out, it'll move exactly back to that same spot. Now if I click rotate, so now it's freezing the rotations, you'll see that all of those went back to 0, and my pivot point now, or my my manipulator for object mode went back to the default rotation of 0, 0, 0. And same with scale, because I scaled this object up a little bit. If I freeze that, it's all 1, 1, 1, 1 now. So this is by freezing those different channels, you get these values to be completely nullified and zeroed out. Something to take note though is if I have in the outliner, let me open my outliner for you guys. Something to keep in your mind is well, first I'll show you that, I guess. There's something called parenting in Maya, and this is more we're gonna need these tools more for rigging, but I'll show you it now. So in Maya, if you select an object and then select another and press P, now when you move that second object, it is the parent of that first object. So you select child and then parent, and you'll see in the outliner that it creates a hierarchy. And so these top ones are controlling these bottom ones. So I moved this all over the place, right? But that cube I created at 0, 0, 0. So now even though we're in the object's axis, we're still inheriting that same rotation axis from the parent, right? So we can have these objects still be at 0, 0, 0, but in a different spot, you know? Because if I zeroed out the rotation, and this were the top one, right? That rotation would go back into 0, and the axis would be reset. And that's kind of more for rigging purposes. We need to know that. But if you're doing some interesting modeling stuff, you might use that as well. So that's the different axes. I'm going to go ahead and create another cube because there's some pretty important tools that we have yet to show you. Make my outliner a little bit smaller. And this is symmetry. And we haven't really talked about that yet, but there is symmetry in Maya, and it's super useful. So real quick right here, in your channel box, I'd like you also to notice, this isn't to do with symmetry, but this is just nice. You have if you open up your channel box, you'll see these inputs polycube. If you click on polycube, you get a bunch of different parameters that you can change. And you'll notice that your scale isn't changing. It's just the width of those edges and faces is changing. But they also have subdivisions. So in subdivisions, instead of going in multi-cutting, holding Control and Shift on both those, you can just go into these and either just shift-click to the bottom and hit 2, and you'll get 2 that way. Or you can just click through these different channels and middle mouse click in your viewport, or you can left click the top one, shift click the bottom one, and then drag, and it will do the same. So you'll see you're getting all of those subdivisions, and it's like, oh man, there's so many to deal with now, you know. But I'm just going to go to 2, so I'm just going to select those, left click the top box, shift click the bottom one, and put 2 in there and press enter. And the reason I had to do that was to show you symmetry. So in our modeling toolkit, you can turn symmetry on by clicking this, and not much happened, right? In fact, nothing really happened. But you'll notice up here, object X is selected. So now you have symmetry on object's X axis. And remember that X is the red axis. So over on negative X, this point will move when we move positive X, and vice versa. So if we go into vertex mode, you'll notice that it also highlighted this other side. So now we can move both sides. This is super. That's why I told you guys to gear it towards a more symmetrical design for your character, because it's a lot easier to work with this way, you know, because we can just work in symmetry mode the whole time, and then you don't have to worry about a lot of other problems that could arise, you know, because you're basically just doing. If you just model you're essentially modeling half the character now, and that's going to be a lot faster than modeling 2 different halves of the character, you know. So I'm just going to go in here, and you'll see that I can kind of move these things around a whole bunch. Imagine that I'm making like the torso of a character right now, right? So if I kind of move this out, if this is the lower part, we're probably going to need to scale this in to make it a little bit skinnier. Move this in. I'm going to kind of move this out. So we got some shape in there now. And it's just nice to work with this symmetry because we can just easily come in here, scale these different things, you know, get them to the proper size. So if this is the arm, right, I can do all of the same tools that we've learned about. And to make this arm, I'm just going to go into face mode and extrude that out. And you'll notice that it's looking the same on both sides. It's perfect, right? But say, because there's some certain cases where symmetry is going to fail. And that it depends on what version of Maya you're in, and I'm not exactly sure what causes symmetry to fail in 2019. I'm not super versed with it yet, but sometimes you'll notice if you're like just examining your model while you're modeling and something is not lining up, and you're like, dang, I want to remake my symmetry. Like, I want my object to be symmetrical again. What you can do is to go turn this off, select your faces, and what we're going to do is called mirroring your mesh. There's a few different ways to do this, but I'm going to show you the most default and the most open and shut, like this is going to work way ever. So first step is duplicating your mesh by pressing Control D. Notice I have another mesh in here now. Same mesh basically, different objects though. If you go into your scale X, you can just press -1. You'll notice that flips over to the other side. And so I'm going to click one, and then I'm going to shift click the other. And I'm going to go to Mesh, Combine. So now those are the same mesh. Or they're the same object, but you'll see they're different meshes, right? Because if I double click, it's going to select that entire shell of that object. You'll be able to move that. So we need to fuse these interior verts together. There's a few ways we can do that. We can drag select over all of them. I'm going to go into 4 mode so I can more clearly see that. I'm going to drag select over all of them. And we can go to Edit Mesh Merge. And it's going to merge on that threshold. But if, say, your symmetry fell out of whack because you, so I'm going to undo that. So say your symmetry fell out of use because of something like this. And if I go back into faces, delete that other object, something like this happened. You're like, there's that weird hole. So what we have to do first is click your verts and then align to X, on the X-axis, right? And you can click, or you can press X, and you'll notice that it's enabling snapping. We've gone over snapping in the past. And you can just snap back to that middle axis. Now that we know that all those points are on that middle axis. If you had like some really weird geo though, you can also sometimes just get that entire edge loop, scale it completely down so it's flat now, and then hold X again and then align to that grid. Then duplicate your mesh, do the -1 on scaling, shift click the other one, mesh combine. Now they're back together, but they're not completely fused. We still have these middle verts not obeying. So we're going to go shift click over all of them. You have all of them selected. Mesh, or edit mesh, merge. And then now if we go into face mode, double click, you'll see that's one shell, but then you have to go in and left click over each individual vert. Don't drag select on this, because if you drag selected, you would just be, if you drag selected and there were still 2 separate verts here, it would just select both of those, and you'd be moving both, and it would look like it's working, but it's really not, you know. So now this is all sealed up. Come on, let's move it. Yeah. We're just testing these. Yeah. Another fast way to test is by drag selecting over all the faces. That way it's not selecting those individual verts and just pulling away. And then if all those verts move with it, then you know that you're set. So that's how you mirror one way. Mirroring another way is, so if I delete half this object, completely delete it, and I select my object. In Mesh, there's a mirror tool, so I'm going to open that up, and then always, I don't know, I've never found a use for this cut geometry tool. I suspect it has something to do with if you already have a mesh that is that's complete but still like a little bit asymmetrical, it would cut it in half and then mirror it. But for now, since we already cut it in half ourselves manually, we can just select mirror axis and then X. Remember, X is red, left and right on this. And since this arrow is pointing this way, that means that this is positive X. So we need it to mirror across negative X. Then you can do combine with the original. Let's just click apply, and then you'll see, there you go. it mirrored it. The only reason I'm telling you, the only reason I showed you that other way first is because sometimes the way that it mirrors and combines is a little bit imprecise. And sometimes you can merge, like if you have a, oh, and our symmetry should be reinstated, and you'll see that it's still there and it's fine. But the reason like, if you have some verts that are now like super close together, and then you do this method, they can sometimes fuse on accident, and it's a problem that's really hard to catch happening when it happens, because like, I don't know, maybe it'll be like under your model or like on like behind your hair or something, somewhere that's like really hard to see, you know. So that's something to keep track of, because that will. So I would be a little bit concerned using this mirror tool, but if it's working fine, then go free. Have fun with it, you know. I'm gonna delete this edge out of there. I'm gonna make sure the verts are gone as well. Yeah. So we did rotation, different axis symmetry, symmetries. Yeah, you guys know all that now. We got the object X there, so you know that you can affect it like this. Something to note is that, like, if you have your mesh like this right now, right, and we basically duplicated and combined the mesh to mirror it, right, if we didn't use that other mirror tool. But you can also do the inverse of this. I'm going to disable symmetry for this. So you can select faces and go into mesh and, ooh, my bad, edit mesh, I believe, yeah, face, and click extract. And what this does is it takes all those faces and it makes a different object. So now when I'm in object mode and I'm clicking around, that's just a completely separate object now. It's not at all merged with that shirt, or that torso mesh, right? The thing this could be useful for is if you had, say, like an armband or something, and then you just wanted to, if I go back before I extracted it, yeah, undo extract face. Say you wanted to make an armband, and you're like, oh man, I don't want to have to like just go in and create like I want to use like basically my existing edge loops to kind of help me do that already. So I could just duplicate that mesh, kind of move it over, or yeah, kind of move it over, and then select those faces and be like, all right, mesh, edit mesh, my bad, extract, and then now you have that separate object. I'm going to delete the other parts of that, and then you can kind of mess with that from there. So it has a super sick armband now. Woo! And when you're modeling, there's no reason to really keep everything into one mesh. Like, say you did have like an armband or something, like it's a completely different object, right? So you might as well model it separately and then just select both and then mesh combine. And then now they're in there. Sweet armband on this guy now. Let's extrude that. Hell yeah. Amazing armband. So that's kind of something that's useful for doing that. But say I have this armband on here now, and we already combined the mesh. Now remember, they're not, I know the tool is called combine mesh or mesh combine, so there's a lot of confusion that arises, but if you go into face mode and double click some faces, you'll see that it is a completely separate mesh, because this is like, no part of this is connected to the verts, no part of the armband is connected to the verts of the arm, right? Also, to focus like that, I just press F. So it just brings whatever you're double clicked on into focus in frame. So no part of that is actually fused with that. So if I go back into object mode and say I wanted to remake this its own separate object, I could go into mesh, and then separate. And you'll notice now that it's its completely own object now and can move around like this. So that's useful for making. And you'll see that in the outliner. Say if you wanted to go into your outliner to select this stuff. Same as armband. And body. You'll see a bunch of these little like forward nodes. And this is a weird way that Maya deals with different types of like separating, extracting, and combining. Like all of these different tools, combine, separate, and extract. It kind of makes these different nodes, and I believe that's for its undo history, but say we want those to just be in the outliner to be separate, two separate objects, and make sure you have them exactly where you want them, because this is going to disable your ability to go back. If you go into delete all by type and do history or non-deformer history, you'll see that they're now under that one object still, and you're like, man, Mike, I don't want them to be in that group, right? I want them to be two separate things. What you can do is click them, shift click them, and do Shift P, because remember P was for parent, but Shift P brought it back out. So that's a nice way of dealing with that. And so now you can move these around. But say you wanted to model some part of the arm still, but this stupid armband is just blocking your vision, right? So in your outliner, or you can just click it in here. You can go into Control Hide, and Control or Hide is done with H. So or Control H, I should say, and that you'll see that it blacked out that armband and it made it invisible now. And there's no other way really to select it. So if you do Shift H, well, there's no way to select it in your viewport anymore, right? So you have to click it in your outliner. So it's good to know like what it was called before it. Like that's like an important reason to name your objects the right name. So if we Control Hide that, then you can just work all you want on the arm, add all the edge loops and stuff, and any shape that you want, and then you just have that armband still there. And you could also do this through the display layers I was talking about, and just adding it to one. This button makes a new layer and adds the object to it. But if I delete that layer, this button just creates a new layer. So if you create a new layer and then turn it off, like that's not going to be turned off with it because it's not on that layer yet. But if I go into Add Selected Objects, now it's on that layer. I can turn that thing off immediately. Simple. I'm going to delete that layer though. And what else is next? Okay, so you guys know about that. All right. So just a few more tools. Say I have like a denser mesh, right? Like I went in and added a bunch of edge loops, and I needed to change stuff about that, right? And you say you're like, ah man, this torso is pretty dang blocky, right? There's some weird topology going on over here. Let me fix that. There you go. That's pretty blocky. I wish it was a bit more shapely. But you don't want to go in and, especially if this is like 3 times as dense, like that can happen a lot, right? This will be fine. You can press B. And that goes into soft select mode. And with B pressed and holding middle mouse click and dragging, you'll see that there's this gradient fall off. And that is anything that's not within that gradient no longer gets moved, but everything that's touching it gets moved a little bit. And you'll see that the more yellow it is, or it might be green. I think it's yellow though. The more yellow it is, the more it gets influenced, right? So you can go in, you can make like the small of the back, right? And pump all this stuff out. And to disable it, you just press B. So if you say, that's where I want it, then you can just press B and it will work like that. So that's soft select. It's good for really organic objects, you know, like when you're working on like a face or something, you're like, I want to move everything a little bit. Then you have that nice gradient fall off that you can affect it with. And so that's soft select. And there's another tool that I've already introduced you guys to, and you know it. But there's a nice little bonus function with it. So in multi-cut, you can create an edge loop, right? But in mesh tools, you can also go to insert edge loop, and it does the exact same thing, pretty much the exact same thing. The only difference is that the insert edge loop tool, this one right here, if you go into the options, it'll open up your tool settings. If you couldn't find those before, this little hammer will open it up. And in those tool settings, there's an option to insert with edge flow. And now if I insert an edge loop right there, whoops. You see how the mesh kind of pumped out right there? It's because Maya's like auto detecting the curvature of these edges and is trying to predict where you want that. So this is really nice for like anytime you're inserting an edge loop. See how it maintains some volume there rather than, let me show you with it off. It just made that flat thing there. So this is super nice. I love this tool, actually. I just wanted you guys to know about multi-cut for just ease of access. And speaking of inserting edge loop stuff, we didn't really go too deep into this, but multi-cut, as it's we've been basically using multi-cut as singular cut because we haven't been showing much of this. I know I've demonstrated some of this in class, but there's much more to it. You can click on singular edges, or you can just straight up cut into your mesh like this and press enter. And then you have new verts right there, like along that cut that we made. The only thing is, guys, remember, I'm going to be asking for no endgons in this character model. In other words, you can't have a poly with more than 4 sides to it. This right here would be considered an endgon. This is a quad because it has 4 sides. 1, 2, 3, 4. This is a tri, has 3. I'd like you to shy away from using tris because you can pretty much model anything with quads. And tris end up destroying your edge flow. Like, look, I can no longer insert an edge loop for some of these things with this weird geometry. I am kind of impressed, actually, that it goes through there now, because back in, ooh, that's actually pretty nice. Because back in my day, back in 2017, this triangle would destroy that edge flow. So, like, say you had to add more scapular detail to this shoulder, you have to insert some edge loops, right, to get the geo to do that. And this triangle here, being here, would normally mess with that. Let's see if the insert edge loop tool works with that. And then I'm going to insert with edge flow. Oh, it does. Ooh. All right. There we go. See, that's Autodesk making some nice changes, actually. Very nice. So, but be that as it may, I still want you to definitely don't use any endgons. Like, that's actually just really bad. That will destroy your mesh, and it'll make porting to outside programs really difficult, actually impossible. And I'd like you to avoid tries because quads are cleaner to look at, and they will still cause issues if you're. I'm sure whatever algorithm was fixing that for us has its limits, you know. So I just want you guys to be aware of that. But that's the strength of the multi-cut tool, though, is that you're able to just click on all of this, and you can go in and cut in your edges and seal all of that stuff up, you know. So, but just don't get too crazy with it, because I know that you can. That's a fast track to getting an unclean mesh. But I just thought you should know about that with multi-cut. So we did insert edge loop with the what was it called? Yeah, insert with edge flow. Yeah, that's perfect. And that's pretty much it for the tools, but there's one more before we head out. And this one is called Bevel. So if I get this whole nub selected, then go back into my mesh tools, or wait a minute, edit mesh, there we go. You guys know about bridge already. Yeah, that's looking fine. I'm just making sure we're not forgetting any other tools before we leave. Bevel, this one is another. This is another one that falls into a fast track for making your mesh unclean, because you can get super dense stuff from this. And you'll see if I just open it up and press apply, well, actually, let me reset it just to make sure. You press apply. You see how it kind of just smoothed that edge out, and it turned it into a row of quads, or like a loop of quads, or a nice edge loop. And basically, if I was to go in and manually do what it does, I would set an edge loop right there, have to click all this again, and I have to scale it in. But it does that along any edge. So there's sometimes when I wouldn't be able to easily select one of those tools, or select all those edges and scale it uniformly, so I could just apply it right here instead, you know, and it goes there. See, here's some of the problem though. If you only click that edge and don't kind of continue the edge loop, you'll see that it now made this disgusting n-gon right here. So that's something to be careful with that. And this is more helpful for hard surface modeling. Say you had a cylinder and you're like, I'm gonna make a nice coffee table, and you wanted that coffee table to have a nice lip to it. Then you could just double click your edges and then bevel it, and you can change how many so it pops up this window in here, and you can change how many segments it does. So you see how dense that gets with that slider. You can change all sorts of stuff. See, this one like folds it in the depth right there. Yeah, so there's a lot of fun stuff to play with there. Just don't get too caught up in it, because like I said, if you have something this dense, you're not going to be able to work with that anymore. Like it's going to be really hard to work with. So be careful with it. But yeah, so that's all the advanced tools, I believe. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to email me about these. It really helps, guys, if you're running into a problem, and if you send me a screen cap of it. If you just like do control print screen and then save that for me, that'd be pretty nice. If you ask me questions, then I have something visually to go through. You can also, like, if you add me on Discord, you can also share your screen with me, and then I can in real time help you out, because I know this stretch for making the character is going to be pretty hard. Like, I'm not lying about that. Like, it's going to be it's gonna be difficult. But yeah, so there's all the tools, and there will be more to come.